Chapter 3 of Industrial Biography, Ironworkers and Toolmakers, by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Iron Smelting by Pit Coal, Dud Dudley. God of his infinite goodness, if he will take notice of his goodness unto this nation, hath made this country a very granary for the supply of smiths with iron, coal, and lime made with coal, which hath much supplied these men with corn also of late, and from these men a great part, not only of this island, but also of his Majesty's other kingdoms and territories, with iron wares have their supply, and wood in these parts almost exhausted, although it were of late a mighty woodland country. Dudley's Metallum Martis, 1665. The severe restrictions enforced by the legislature against the use of wood in iron smelting had the effect of almost extinguishing the manufacture. New furnaces ceased to be erected, and many of the old ones were allowed to fall into decay, until it began to be feared that this important branch of industry would become completely lost. The same restrictions alike affected the operations of glass manufacture, which, with the aid of foreign artisans, had been gradually established in England, and was becoming a thriving branch of trade. It was even proposed that the smelting of iron should be absolutely prohibited. "Many think," said a contemporary writer, "that there should be no works anywhere. They do so devour the woods." The use of iron, however, could not be dispensed with. The very foundations of society rested upon an abundant supply of it, for tools and implements of peace, as well as for weapons of war. In the dearth of the article at home, a supply of it was therefore sought from abroad, and both iron and steel came to be imported in largely increased quantities. This branch of trade was principally in the hands of the Steelyard Company of Foreign Merchants, established in Upper Thames Street, a little above London Bridge, and they imported large quantities of iron and steel from foreign countries, principally from Sweden, Germany, and Spain. The best iron came from Spain, though the Spaniards on their part coveted our English-made cannons, which were better manufactured than theirs, while the best steel came from Germany and Sweden. Under these circumstances, it was natural that persons interested in the English iron manufacture should turn their attention to some other description of fuel, which would serve as a substitute for the prohibited article. There was known to be an abundance of coal in the northern and midland counties, and it occurred to some speculators, more than usually daring, to propose it as a substitute for the charcoal fuel made from wood. But the same popular prejudice which existed against the use of coal for domestic purposes prevented its being employed for purposes of manufacture, and they were thought very foolish persons indeed who first promulgated the idea of smelting iron by means of pit coal. The old manufacturers held it to be impossible to reduce the ore in any other way than by the means of charcoal of wood. It was only when the wood in the neighbourhood of the ironworks had been almost entirely burnt up that the manufacturers were driven to entertain the idea of using coal as a substitute. But more than 100 years passed before the practice of smelting iron by its means became general. The first who took out a patent for the purpose was one Simon Sturtevant, a German skilled in mining operations, the professed object of his invention being to neal, melt, and work all kinds of metal ores, irons, and steels with sea coal, pit coal, earth coal, and brush fuel. The principal end of his invention, he states in his Treatise of Metallica, is to save the consumption and waste of the woods and timber of the country, and should his design succeed, he holds that it will prove to be the best and most profitable business and invention that ever was known or invented in England these many years. He says he has already made trial of the process on a small scale, and is confident that it will prove equally successful on a large one. Sturtevant was not very specific as to his process, but it incidentally appears to have been his purpose to reduce the coal by an imperfect combustion to the condition of coke, thereby ridding it of those malignant properties which are averse to the nature of metallic substances. The subject was treated by him, as was customary in those days, as a great mystery, made still more mysterious by the multitude of learned words under which he undertook to describe his ignic invention. All the operations of industry were then treated as secrets. Each trade was a craft, and those who followed it were called craftsmen. Even the common carpenter was a handicraftsman, and skilled artisans were cunning men. But the higher branches of work were mysteries, the communication of which to others was carefully guarded by the regulation of the trades guilds. Although the early patents are called specifications, they in reality specify nothing. They are, for the most part, a mere haze of words, from which very little definite information can be gleaned as to the processes patented. It may be that Sturtevant had not yet reduced his idea to any practicable method, and therefore could not definitely explain it. However that may be, it is certain that his process failed when tried on a large scale, and Sturtevant's patent was accordingly cancelled at the end of a year. The idea, however, had been fairly born, and repeated patents were taken out with the same object from time to time. Thus, immediately on Sturtevant's failure becoming known, one John Rovenzon, who had been mixed up with the other's adventure, applied for a patent for making iron by the same process, which was granted him in 1613. His Treatise of Metallica shows that Rovenzon had a true conception of the method of manufacture. Nevertheless, he too failed in carrying out the invention in practice, and his patent was also cancelled. Though these failures were very discouraging, like experiments continued to be made and patents taken out, principally by Dutchmen and Germans, but no decided success seems to have attended their efforts until the year of 1620, when Lord Dudley took out his patent for melting iron ore, making bar iron, etc., with coal in furnaces with bellows. This patent was taken out at the insistence of his son, Dud Dudley, whose story we gather partly from his treatise entitled Metallum Martis, and partly from various petitions presented by him to the king, which are preserved in the State Paper Office, and it runs as follows. Dud Dudley was born in 1599, the natural son of Edward Lord Dudley of Dudley Castle in the county of Worcester. He was the fourth of 11 children by the same mother, who is described in the pedigree of the family given in the Herald's Visitation of the county of Stafford in the year 1663, signed by Dud Dudley himself, as Elizabeth, daughter of William Tomlinson of Dudley, concubine of Edward Lord Dudley. Dud's eldest brother is described in the same pedigree as Robert Dudley, squire of Netherton Hall, and as his sisters mostly married well, several of them county gentlemen, it is obvious that the family, notwithstanding that the children were born out of wedlock, held a good position in their neighbourhood, and were regarded with respect. Lord Dudley, though married and having legitimate heirs at the time, seems to have attended to the bringing up of his natural children, educating them carefully, and afterwards employing them in confidential offices connected with the management of his extensive property. Dud describes himself as taking great delight, when a youth, in his father's ironworks near Dudley, where he obtained considerable knowledge of the various processes of the manufacture. The town of Dudley was already a centre of the iron manufacture, though chiefly of small wares, such as nails, horseshoes, keys, locks, and common agricultural tools. And it was estimated that there were about 20,000 smiths and workers in iron of various kinds, living within a circuit of 10 miles of Dudley Castle. But as in the southern counties, the production of iron had suffered great diminution from the want of fuel in the district, though formerly a mighty woodland country, and many important branches of the local trade were brought almost to a standstill. Yet there was an extraordinary abundance of coal to be met with in the neighbourhood, coal in some places lying in seams 10 feet thick, ironstone 4 feet thick immediately under the coal, with limestone conveniently adjacent to both. The conjunction seems almost providential, as if, observes Dud, God had decreed the time when and how these smiths should be supplied, and this island also, with iron, and most especially that this coal and ironstone should give the first and just occasion for the invention of smelting iron with pit coal; though, as we have already seen, all attempts heretofore made with that object had practically failed. Dud was a special favourite of the Earl, his father, who encouraged his speculations with reference to the improvement of the iron manufacture, and gave him an education calculated to enable him to turn his excellent practical abilities to account. He was studying at Balliol College, Oxford, in the year 1619, when the Earl sent for him to take charge of an iron furnace and 2 forges in the Chase of Pensnet in Worcestershire. He was no sooner installed manager of the works than, feeling hampered by the want of wood for fuel, his attention was directed to the employment of pit coal as a substitute. He altered his furnace accordingly, so as to adopt it to the new process, and the result of the first trial was such as to induce him to persevere. It is nowhere stated in Dudley's treatise what was the precise nature of the method adopted by him, but it is most probable that, in endeavouring to substitute coal for wood as fuel, he would subject the coal to a process similar to that of charcoal burning. The result would be what is called coke, and as Dudley informs us that he followed up his first experiments with a second blast, by means of which he was enabled to produce good marketable iron, the presumption is that his success was also due to an improvement of the blast, which he contrived for the purpose of keeping up the active combustion of the fuel. Though the quantity produced by the new process was comparatively small, not more than 3 tons a week from each furnace, Dudley anticipated that greater experience would enable him to increase the quantity, and at all events he had succeeded in proving the practicability of smelting iron with fuel made from pit coal, which so many before him had tried in vain. Immediately after the second trial had been made with such good issue, Dud wrote to his father, the Earl, then in London, informing him what he had done, and desiring him at once to obtain a patent for the invention from King James. This was readily granted, and the patent, No. 18, dated 22nd of February 1620, was taken out in the name of Lord Dudley himself. Dud proceeded with the manufacture of iron at Pensnet, and also at Cradley in Staffordshire, where he erected another furnace, and a year after the patent was granted he was enabled to send up to the Tower, by the King's command, a considerable quantity of the new iron for trial. Many experiments were made with it, its qualities were fairly tested, and it was pronounced good merchantable iron. Dud adds in his treatise that his brother-in-law, Richard Parkhouse of Sedgeley, had a fowling gun there made of the pit coal, which was well approved. There was therefore every prospect of the new method of manufacture becoming fairly established, and with greater experience further improvements might with confidence be anticipated, when a succession of calamities occurred to the inventor which involved him in difficulties, and put an effectual stop to the progress of his enterprise. The new works had been in successful operation little more than a year, when a flood, long after known as the Great May Day Flood, swept away Dudley's principal works at Cradley, and otherwise inflicted much damage through the district. At the market town called Stourbridge, says Dud in the course of his curious narrative, although the author sent with speed to preserve the people from drowning, and one resolute man was carried from the bridge there in the daytime, the nether part of the town was so deep in water that the people had much ado to preserve their lives in the uppermost rooms of their houses. Dudley himself received very little sympathy for his losses. On the contrary, the iron smelters of the district rejoiced exceedingly at the destruction of his works by the flood. They had seen him making good iron by his new patent process, and selling it cheaper than they could afford to do. They accordingly put in circulation all manner of disparaging reports about his iron, It was bad iron, not fit to be used. Indeed, no iron except what was smelted with charcoal of wood could be good. To smelt it with coal was a dangerous invention, and could only result in some great public calamity. The ironmasters even appealed to King James to put a stop to Dud's manufacture, alleging that his iron was not merchantable. And then came the great flood, which swept away his works, the hostile ironmasters now hoping that there was an end for ever of Dudley's pit coal iron. But Dud, with his wonted energy, forthwith set to work and repaired his furnaces and forges, though at great cost, and in the course of a short time the new manufacture was again in full progress. The ironmasters raised a fresh outcry against him, and addressed another strong memorial against Dud and his iron to King James. This seems to have taken effect, and in order to ascertain the quality of the article by testing it upon a large scale, the king commanded Dudley to send up to the Tower of London with every possible speed quantities of all sorts of bar iron made by him, fit for the making of muskets, carbines, and iron for great bolts for shipping, which iron, continues Dud, being so tried by artists and smiths, the ironmasters and ironmongers were all silenced until the 21st year of King James's reign. The ironmasters then endeavoured to get the Dudley patent included in the monopolies to be abolished by the statutes of that year. But all they could accomplish was the limitation of the patent to 14 years instead of 31, the special exemption of the patent from the operation of the statute affording a sufficient indication of the importance already attached to the invention. After that time Dudley went on with his invention cheerfully, and made annually great store of iron, good and merchantable, and sold it unto divers men at 12 pounds per ton. I also, said he, made all sorts of cast iron wares, as brewing cisterns, pots, mortars, etc., better and cheaper than any yet made in these nations with charcoal, some of which are yet to be seen by any man at the author's house in the city of Worcester that desires to be satisfied of the truth of the invention. Notwithstanding this decided success, Dudley encountered nothing but trouble and misfortune. The ironmasters combined to resist his invention. They fastened lawsuits upon him, and succeeded in getting him ousted from his works at Cradley. From thence he removed to Himley in the county of Stafford, where he set up a pit coal furnace. But being without the means of forging the iron into bars, he was constrained to sell the pig iron to the charcoal ironmasters, who did him much prejudice, not only deriding his stock, but also disparaging his iron. He next proceeded to erect a large new furnace at Hasco Bridge, near Sedgeley, in the same county, for the purpose of carrying out the manufacture on the most improved principles. This furnace was of stone, 27 feet square, provided with unusually large bellows, and when in full work he says he was enabled to turn out 7 tons of iron per week, the greatest quantity of pit coal iron ever made yet in Great Britain. At the same place he discovered and opened out new workings of coal 10 feet thick, lying immediately over the ironstone, and he prepared to carry on his operations on a large scale. But the new works were scarcely finished when a mob of rioters, instigated by the charcoal ironmasters, broke in upon them, cut in pieces the new bellows, and destroyed the machinery, and laid the results of all his deep-laid ingenuity and persevering industry in ruins. From that time forward Dudley was allowed no rest nor peace. He was attacked by mobs, worried by lawsuits, and eventually overwhelmed by debts. He was then seized by his creditors and sent up to London, where he was held prisoner in the comptoir for several £1000s. The charcoal iron men thus for a time remained masters of the field. Charles I seems to have taken pity on the suffering inventor, and on his earnest petition, setting forth the great advantage to the nation of his invention, from which he had as yet derived no advantage, but only losses, sufferings, and persecution, the king granted him a renewal of his patent in the year 1638, 3 other gentlemen joining him as partners, and doubtless providing the requisite capital for carrying on the manufacture after the plans of the inventor. but Dud's evil fortune continued to pursue him. The patent had scarcely been secured ere the Civil War broke out, and the arts of peace must at once perforce give place to the arts of war. Dud's nature would not suffer him to be neutral at such a time, and when the nation divided itself into two hostile camps, his predilections being strongly loyalist, he took the side of the king with his father. It would appear from a petition presented by him to Charles II. in 1660, setting forth his sufferings in the royal cause, and praying for restoral of certain offices which he had enjoyed under Charles I., that as early as the year 1637 he had been employed by the king on a mission into Scotland, in the train of the Marquis of Hamilton, the king's commissioner. Again, in 1639, leaving his ironworks and partners, he accompanied Charles on his expedition across the Scotch border, and was present with the army until its discomfiture at Newburn, near Newcastle, in the following year. The sword was now fairly drawn, and Dud seems for a time to have abandoned his ironworks and followed entirely the fortunes of the king. He was sworn surveyor of the Mews or Armoury in 1640, but being unable to pay for the patent, another was sworn in his place. Yet his loyalty did not falter, for in the beginning of 1642, when Charles set out from London shortly after the fall of Stafford and Laud, Dud went with him. He was present before Hull, when Sir John Hotham shut its gates in the king's face; at York, when the royal commissions of Array were sent out enjoining all loyal subjects to send men, arms, money, and horses for the defence of the king and maintenance of the law; at Nottingham, where the royal standard was raised; at Coventry, where the townspeople refused the king entrance and fired upon his troops from the walls; at Edge Hill, where the first great but indecisive battle was fought between the contending parties. In short, as Dud Dudley states in his petition, he was in most of the battles that year, and also supplying his late Sacred Majesty's magazines of Stafford, Worcester, Dudley Castle, and Oxford, with arms, shot, drakes, and cannon, and also became major unto Sir Francis Worsley's regiment, which was much decayed. In 1643, according to the statement contained in his petition above referred to, Dud Dudley acted as military engineer in setting out the fortifications of Worcester and Stafford, and furnishing them with ordnance. After the taking of Lichfield, in which he had a share, he was made colonel of dragoons, and accompanied the Queen with his regiment to the royal headquarters at Oxford. The year after we find him at the siege of Gloucester, then at the first battle of Newbury, leading the Forlorn Hope with Sir George Lisle, afterwards marching with Sir Charles Lucas into the associate counties, and present at the royalist rout at Newport. That he was esteemed a valiant and skilful officer is apparent from the circumstance that in 1645 he was appointed General of Prince Maurice's train of artillery, and afterwards held the same rank under Lord Ashley. The iron districts being still for the most part occupied by the royal armies, our military engineer turned his practical experience to account by directing the forging of drakes of bar iron, which were found of great use, giving up his own dwelling house in the city of Worcester for the purpose of carrying out the manufacture of these and other arms. But Worcester and the western towns fell before the Parliamentarian armies in 1646, and all the ironworks belonging to royalists, from which the principal supplies of arms had been drawn by the king's army, were forthwith destroyed. Dudley fully shared in the dangers and vicissitudes of that trying period, and bore his part throughout like a valiant soldier. For 2 years nothing was heard of him until in 1648, when the king's party drew together again and made head in different parts of the country, north and south. Goring raised his standard in Essex, but was driven by Fairfax into Colchester, where he defended himself for 2 months. While the siege was in progress, the royalists determined to make an attempt to raise it. On this Dudley again made his appearance in the field, and, joining sundry other counties, he proceeded to raise 200 men, mostly at his own charge. They were, however, no sooner mustered in Boscobella woods near Madeley than they were attacked by the Parliamentarians, and dispersed or taken prisoners. Dud was among those so taken, and he was first carried to Hartlebury Castle, and thence to Worcester, where he was imprisoned. Recounting the sufferings of himself and his followers on this occasion, in the petition presented to Charles II. in 1660, he says, 200 men were dispersed, killed, and some taken, namely Major Harcourt, Major Elliots, Captain Long, and Cornet Hodgetts, of whom Major Harcourt was miserably burned with matches. The petitioner and the rest were stripped almost naked, and in triumph and scorn carried up to the city of Worcester, which place Dud had fortified for the king, and kept close prisoners with double guards set upon the prison and the city. Notwithstanding this close watch and durance, Dudley and Major Elliots contrived to break out of gaol, making their way over the tops of the houses, afterwards passing the guards at the city gates, and escaping into the open country. Being hotly pursued, they travelled during the night, and took to the trees during the daytime. They succeeded in reaching London, but only to drop again into the Lion's Mouth, for first Major Elliots was captured, then Dudley, and both were taken before Sir John Warner, the Lord Mayor, who forthwith sent them before the cursed Committee of Insurrection, as Dudley calls them. The prisoners were summarily sentenced to be shot to death, and were meanwhile closely imprisoned in the Gatehouse at Westminster with other royalists. The day before their intended execution, the prisoners formed a plan of escape. It was Sunday morning, the 20th of August, 1648, when they seized their opportunity, at 10 of the clock in sermon time, and overpowering the gaolers, Dudley, with Sir Henry Bates, Major Elliots, Captain South, Captain Paris, and 6 others, succeeded in getting away, and making again for the open country. Dudley had received a wound in the leg, and could only get along with great difficulty. He records that he proceeded on crutches through Worcester, Tewkesbury, and Gloucester to Bristol, having been fed 3 weeks in private in an enemy's haymow. Even the most lynx-eyed parliamentarian must have failed to recognise the quondam royalist general of artillery in the helpless creature dragging himself along upon crutches, and he reached Bristol in safety. His military career now over, he found himself absolutely penniless. His estate of about £200 per annum had been sequestered and sold by the government. His house in Worcester had been seized, and his sickly wife turned out of doors, and his goods, stock, great shop, and ironworks, which he himself valued at £2,000, were destroyed. He had also lost the offices of Sergeant at Arms, Lieutenant of Ordnance, and Surveyor of the Mews, which he had held under the king. In a word, he found himself reduced to a state of utter destitution. Dudley was for some time under the necessity of living in great privacy at Bristol, but when the king had been executed and the royalists were finally crushed at Worcester, Dud gradually emerged from his concealment. He was still the sole possessor of the great secret of smelting iron with pit coal, and he resolved upon one more commercial adventure in the hope of yet turning it to good account. He succeeded in inducing Walter Stevens, line-draper, and John Stone, merchant, both of Bristol, to join him as partners in an ironwork which they proceeded to erect near that city. The buildings were well advanced, and nearly £700 had been expended, when a quarrel occurred between Dudley and his partners, which ended in the stoppage of the works and the concern being thrown into Chancery. Dudley alleges that the other partners cunningly drew him into a bond, and did unjustly enter staple actions in Bristol of great value against him, because he was of the king's party. But it would appear as if there had been some twist or infirmity of temper in Dudley himself, which prevented him from working harmoniously with such persons as he became associated with in affairs of business. In the meantime, other attempts were made to smelt iron with pit coal. Dudley says that Cromwell and the then Parliament granted a patent to Captain Buck for the purpose, and that Cromwell himself, Major Wildman, and various others were partners in the patent. They erected furnaces and works in the Forest of Dean, but though Cromwell and his officers could fight and win battles, they could not smelt and forge iron with pit coal. They brought one Dagny, an Italian glassmaker, from Bristol to erect a new furnace for them, provided with sundry pots of glasshouse clay, but no success attended their efforts. The partners, knowing of Dudley's possession of the grand secret, invited him to visit their works, but all they could draw from him was that they would never succeed in making iron to profit by the methods they were pursuing. They next proceeded to erect other works at Bristol, but still they failed. Major Wildman bought Dudley's sequestered estate, in the hope of being able to extort his secret of making iron with pit coal, but all their attempts proving abortive, they at length abandoned the enterprise in despair. In 1656, one Captain Copley obtained from Cromwell a further patent with a similar object, and erected works near Bristol and also in the forest of Kingswood. The mechanical engineers employed by Copley failed in making his bellows blow, on which he sent for Dudley, who forthwith made his bellows to be blown fightably. But Copley failed, like his predecessors, in making iron, and at length he too desisted from further experiments. Such continued to be the state of things until the Restoration, when we find Dudley a petitioner to the king for the renewal of his patent. He was also a petitioner for compensation in respect of the heavy losses he had sustained during the civil wars. The king was besieged by crowds of applicants of a similar sort, but Dudley was no more successful than the others. He failed in obtaining the renewal of his patent. Another applicant for the like privilege, probably having greater interest at court, proved more successful. Colonel Prodger and 3 others were granted a patent to make iron with coal, but Dudley knew the secret, which the new patentees did not, and their patent came to nothing. Dudley continued to address the king in importunate petitions, asking to be restored to his former offices of Sergeant at Arms, Lieutenant of Ordnance, and Surveyor of the Mews or Armoury. He also petitioned to be appointed Master of the Charter House in Smithfield, professing himself willing to take anything or hold any living. We find him sending in 2 petitions to a similar effect in June 1660, and a third shortly after. The result was that he was reappointed to the office of Sergeant at Arms, but the mastership of the Charter House was not disposed of until 1662, when it fell to the lot of one Thomas Watson. In 1661 we find a patent granted to Mr. William Chamberlain and Dudley, Esquire, for the sole use of their new invention of plating steel, etc., and tinning the said plates. But whether Dudley was the person referred to, we are unable precisely to determine. A few years later he seems to have succeeded in obtaining the means of prosecuting his original invention, for in his Metallum Martis, published in 1665, he describes himself as living at Green's Lodge in Staffordshire, and he says that near it are 4 forges, Green's Forge, Swin Forge, Heath Forge, and Cradley Forge, where he practises his perfect invention. These forges, he adds, have barred all or most of their iron with pit coal since the author's first invention in 1618, which hath preserved much wood. In these 4, besides many other forges, do the like, yet the author hath had no benefit thereby to this present. From that time forward Dud becomes lost to sight. He seems eventually to have retired to St. Helens in Worcestershire, where he died in 1684, in the 85th year of his age. He was buried in the parish church there, and a monument, now destroyed, was erected to his memory. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Industrial Biography, Ironworkers and Toolmakers, by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Andrew Yarranton. There never have been wanting men to whom England's improvement by sea and land was one of the dearest thoughts of their lives, and to whom England's good was the foremost of their worldly considerations. And such, emphatically, was Andrew Yarranton, a true patriot in the best sense of the word. Dove, Elements of Political Science. That industry had a sore time of it during the Civil Wars will further appear from the following brief account of Andrew Yarranton, which may be taken as a companion memoir to that of Dud Dudley. For Yarranton also was a Worcester ironmaster and a soldier, though on the opposite side. But more even than Dudley was he a man of public spirit and enterprise, an enlightened political economist, long before political economy had been recognised as a science, and in many respects a true national benefactor. Bishop Watson said he ought to have had a statue erected to his memory because of his eminent public services, and an able modern writer has gone so far as to say of him that he was the founder of English political economy, the first man in England who saw and said that peace was better than war, that trade better than plunder, that honest industry was better than martial greatness, and that the best occupation of a government was to secure prosperity at home and let other nations alone. Yet the name of Andrew Yarranton is scarcely remembered, or is at most known only to a few readers of half-forgotten books. The following brief outline of his history is gathered from his own narrative and from documents in the State Paper Office. Andrew Yarranton was born on the farmstead of Larford in the parish of Astley in Worcestershire in the year 1616. In his 16th year he was put apprentice to a Worcester line draper, and remained at that trade for some years. But not liking it, he left it, and was leading a country life when the Civil War broke out. Unlike Dudley, he took the side of the Parliament and joined their army, in which he served for some time as a soldier. His zeal and abilities commended him to his officers, and he was raised from one position to another, until in the course of a few years we find him holding the rank of captain. "While a soldier," says he, "I had sometimes the honour and misfortune to lodge and dislodge an army." But this is all the information he gives us of his military career. In the year 1648 he was instrumental in discovering and frustrating a design, on the part of the Royalists, to seize Doyley House in the county of Hereford and other strongholds, for which he received the thanks of Parliament for his ingenuity, discretion, and valour, and a substantial reward of £500. He was also recommended to the Committee of Worcester for further employment, but from that time we hear no more of him in connection with the Civil Wars. When Cromwell assumed the supreme control of affairs, Yarranton retired from the army with most of the Presbyterians, and devoted himself to industrial pursuits. We then find him engaged in carrying on the manufacture of iron at Astley near Bewdley in Worcestershire. "In the year 1652," says he, "I entered upon ironworks, and plied them for several years." He made it a subject of his diligent study how to provide employment for the poor, then much distressed by the late wars. With the help of his wife he established a manufacture of linen, which was attended with good results. Observing how the difficulties of communication, by reason of the badness of the roads, hindered the development of the rich natural resources of the western counties, he applied himself to the improvement of the navigation of the larger rivers, making surveys of them at his own cost, and endeavouring to stimulate local enterprise so as to enable him to carry his plans into effect. While thus occupied, the restoration of Charles II took place, and, whether through envy or enmity, Yarranton's activity excited the suspicion of the authorities. His journeys from place to place seemed to them to point to some Presbyterian plot on foot. On the 13th of November 1660, Lord Windsor, Lord Lieutenant of the county, wrote to the Secretary of State, "There is a Quaker in prison for speaking treason against his Majesty, and a countryman also, and Captain Yarranton, for refusing to obey my authority." It would appear from subsequent letters that Yarranton must have lain in prison for nearly 2 years, charged with conspiring against the king's authority, the only evidence against him consisting of some anonymous letters. At the end of May 1662 he succeeded in making his escape from the custody of the Provost Marshal. The High Sheriff scoured the county after him at the head of a party of horse, and then he communicated to the Secretary of State, Sir Edward Nicholas, that the suspected conspirator could not be found, and was supposed to have made his way to London. Before the end of a month Yarranton was again in custody, as appears from the communication of certain Justices of Surrey to Sir Edward Nicholas. As no further notice of Yarranton occurs in the State Papers, and as we shortly after find him publicly occupied in carrying out his plans for improving the navigation of the western rivers, it is probable that his innocence of any plot was established after a legal investigation. A few years later he published in London a quarto tract entitled A Full Discovery of the First Presbyterian Sham Plot, which most probably contained a vindication of his conduct. Yarranton was no sooner at liberty than we find him again occupied with his plans of improved inland navigation. His first scheme was to deepen the small river Solwap, so as to connect Droitwich with the Severn by a water communication, and thus facilitate the transport of the salt so abundantly yielded by the brine springs near that town. In 1665 the burgesses of Droitwich agreed to give him £750 and 8 salt vats in Upwich, valued at £80 per annum, with 3/4 of a vat in Northwich for 21 years in payment for the work. But the times were still unsettled, and Yarranton and his partner Wall not being rich, the scheme was not then carried into effect. In the following year we find him occupied with a similar scheme to open up the navigation of the river Stour, passing by Stourport and Kidderminster, and connect it by an artificial cut with the river Trent. Some progress was made with this undertaking, so far in advance of the age, but like the other it came to a standstill for want of money, and more than 100 years passed before it was carried out by a kindred genius, James Brindley, the great canal maker. Mr. Chambers says that when Yarranton's scheme was first brought forward, it met with violent opposition and ridicule. The undertaking was thought wonderfully bold, and, joined to its great extent, the sandy, spongy nature of the ground, the high banks necessary to prevent the inundation of the Stour on the canal, furnished its opponents, if not with sound argument, at least with very specious topics for opposition and laughter. Yarranton's plan was to make the river itself navigable, and, by uniting it with other rivers, open up a communication with the Trent, while Brindley's was to cut a canal parallel with the river, and supply it with water from thence. Yarranton himself thus accounts for the failure of his schemes in England's Improvement by Sea and Land. "It was my projection," he says, "and I will tell you the reason why it was not finished. The river Stour and some other rivers were granted by an Act of Parliament to certain persons of honour, and some progress was made with the work. But within a small while after the Act passed, it was let fall again, and it being a brat of my own, I was not willing it should be abortive, wherefore I made offers to perfect it, having a third part of the inheritance to me and my heirs for ever, and we came to an agreement, upon which I fell on, and made it completely navigable from Stourbridge to Kidderminster, and carried down many 100 tons of coal, and laid out nearly £1,000, and there it was obstructed for want of money." Another of Yarranton's far-sighted schemes of a similar kind was one to connect the Thames with the Severn by means of an artificial cut, at the very place where, more than a century after his death, it was actually carried out by modern engineers. This canal, it appears, was twice surveyed under his direction by his son. He did, however, succeed in his own time in opening up the navigation of the Avon, and was the first to carry barges upon its waters from Tewkesbury to Stratford. The improvement of agriculture, too, had a share of Yarranton's attention. He saw the soil exhausted by long tillage and constantly repeated crops of rye, and he urged that the land should have rest, or at least rotation of crop. With this object he introduced clover seed, and supplied it largely to the farmers of the western counties, who found their land doubled in value by the new method of husbandry, and it shortly became adopted throughout the county. Seeing how commerce was retarded by the small accommodation provided for shipping at the then principal ports, Yarranton next made surveys and planned docks for the City of London. But though he zealously advocated the subject, he found few supporters, and his plans proved fruitless. In this respect he was nearly 150 years before his age, and the London importers continued to conduct their shipping business in the crowded tideway of the Thames, down even to the very beginning of this century. While carrying on his ironworks, it occurred to Yarranton that it would be of great national advantage if the manufacture of tin plate could be introduced into England. Although the richest tin mines then known existed in this country, the mechanical arts were at so low an ebb that we were almost entirely dependent upon foreigners for the supply of the articles manufactured from the metal. The Saxons were the principal consumers of English tin, and we obtained from them in return nearly the whole of our tin plates. All attempts made to manufacture them in England had hitherto failed, the beating out of the iron by hammers into laminae sufficiently thin and smooth, and the subsequent distribution and fixing of the film of tin over the surface of the iron, proving difficulties which the English manufacturers were unable to overcome. To master these difficulties, the indefatigable Yarranton set himself to work. Knowing, says he, the usefulness of tin plates and the goodness of our metals for that purpose, I did about 16 years since, i.e. about 1665, endeavour to find out the way for making thereof, whereupon I acquainted a person of much riches, and one that was very understanding in the iron manufacture, who was pleased to say that he had often designed to get the trade into England, but never could find out the way. Upon which it was agreed that a sum of moneys should be advanced by several persons for the defraying of my charges of travelling to the place where these plates were made, and from thence to bring away the art of making them. Upon which an able fireman that well understood the nature of iron was made choice of to accompany me, and being fitted with an ingenious interpreter that well understood the language, and that had dealt much in that commodity, we marched first from Hamburg, then to Leipzig, and from thence to Dresden, the Duke of Saxony's court, where we had notice of the place where the plates were made, which was in a large tract of mountainous land, running from a place called Segerhutton unto a town called Ohr, being in length about 20 miles. It is curious to find out how much of the national industry of England has been influenced by the existence, from time to time, of religious persecutions abroad, which had the effect of driving skilled Protestant artisans, more particularly from Flanders and France, into England, where they enjoyed the special protection of successive English governments, and founded various important branches of manufacture. But it appears from the history of the tin manufacturers of Saxony that that country also had profited in like manner by the religious persecutions of Germany, and even of England itself. Thus we are told by Yarranton that it was a Cornish miner, a Protestant, banished out of England for his religion in Queen Mary's time, who discovered the tin mines at Ohr, and that a Romish priest of Bohemia, who had been converted to Lutheranism and fled into Saxony for refuge, was the chief instrument in the manufacture until it was perfected. These two men were held in great regard by the Duke of Saxony as well as by the people of the country, for their ingenuity and industry proved the source of great prosperity and wealth. Several fine cities, said Yarranton, having been raised by the riches proceeding from the tin works. Not less than 80,000 men depending upon the trade for their subsistence, and when Yarranton visited Ohr, he found that a statue had been erected to the memory of the Cornish miner who first discovered the tin. Yarranton was very civilly received by the miners, and contrary to his expectation, he was allowed freely to inspect the tin works and examine the methods by which the iron plates were rolled out, as well as the process of tinning them. He was even permitted to engage a number of skilled workmen, whom he brought over with him to England for the purpose of starting the manufacture in this country. A beginning was made, and the tin plates manufactured by Yarranton's men were pronounced of better quality even than those made in Saxony. Many thousand plates, Yarranton says, were made from iron raised in the Forest of Dean, and were tinned over with Cornish tin; and the plates proved far better than the German ones, by reason of the toughness and flexibleness of our forest iron. One Mr. Bison, a tinman in Worcester, Mr. Lydiot near Fleet Bridge, and Mr. Harrison near King's Bench, have wrought many and know their goodness. As Yarranton's account was written and published during the lifetime of the parties, there is no reason to doubt the accuracy of his statement. Arrangements were made to carry on the manufacture upon a large scale, but the secret having got wind, a patent was taken out, or trumped up, as Yarranton calls it, for the manufacture, the patentee being countenanced by some persons of quality, and Yarranton was precluded from carrying his operations further. It is not improbable that the patentee in question was William Chamberlain, Dud Dudley's quondam partner in the iron manufacture. "What with the patent being in our way," says Yarranton, "and the richest of our partners being afraid to offend great men in power, who had their eye upon us, it caused the thing to cool, and the making of the tin plates was neither proceeded in by us, nor possibly could be by him that had the patent, because neither he that hath the patent nor those that have countenanced him can make one plate fit for use." Yarranton's labours were thus lost to the English public for a time, and we continued to import all our tin plates from Germany till about 60 years later, when a tin plate manufactory was established by Capel Hanbury at Pontypool in Monmouthshire, where it has since continued to be successfully carried on. We can only briefly refer to the subsequent history of Andrew Yarranton. Shortly after his journey into Saxony, he proceeded to Holland to examine the inland navigations of the Dutch, to inspect their linen and other manufactures, and to inquire into the causes of the then extraordinary prosperity of that country compared with England. Industry was in a very languishing state at home. "People confess they are sick," said Yarranton, "that trade is in a consumption, and the whole nation languishes." He therefore determined to ascertain whether something useful might not be learnt from the example of Holland. The Dutch were then the hardest working and the most thriving people in Europe. They were manufacturers and carriers for the world. Their fleets floated on every known sea, and their herring busses swarmed along our coasts as far north as the Hebrides. The Dutch supplied our markets with fish caught within sight of our own shores, while our coasting population stood idly looking on. Yarranton regarded this state of things as most discreditable, and he urged the establishment of various branches of home industry as the best way of outdoing the Dutch without fighting them. Whenever he travelled abroad, in Germany or in Holland, he saw industry attended by wealth and comfort, and idleness by poverty and misery. The same pursuits, he held, would prove as beneficial to England as they would abundantly prove to have been to Holland. The healthy life of work was good for all, for individuals as for the whole nation, and if we would outdo the Dutch, he held that we must outdo them in industry. But all must be done honestly and by fair means. "Common honesty," said Yarranton, "is as necessary and needful in kingdoms and commonwealths that depend upon trade as discipline is in an army; and where there is want of common honesty in a kingdom or commonwealth, from thence trade shall depart. For as the honesty of all governments is, so shall be their riches; and as their honour, honesty, and riches are, so will be their strength; and as their honour, honesty, riches, and strength are, so will be their trade. These are 5 sisters that go hand in hand, and must not be parted." Admirable sentiments, which are as true now as they were 200 years ago, when Yarranton urged them upon the attention of the English public. On his return from Holland, he accordingly set on foot various schemes of public utility. He stirred up a movement for the encouragement of the British fisheries. He made several journeys into Ireland for the purpose of planting new manufactures there. He surveyed the river Slade with the object of rendering it navigable, and proposed a plan for improving the harbour of Dublin. He also surveyed the Dee in England with a view to its being connected with the Severn. Chambers says that on the decline of his popularity in 1677, he was taken by Lord Clarendon to Salisbury to survey the river Avon, and to find out how that river might be made navigable, and also whether a safe harbour for ships could be made at Christchurch; and that, having found out where he thought safe anchorage might be obtained, his lordship proceeded to act upon Yarranton's recommendations. Another of his grand schemes was the establishment of the linen manufacture in central counties of England, which he showed were well adapted to the growth of flax, and he calculated that if success attended his efforts, at least 2 millions of money then sent out of the country for the purchase of foreign linen would be retained at home, besides increasing the value of the land on which the flax was grown, and giving remunerative employment to our own people, then emigrating for want of work. "Nothing but sloth or envy," he said, "can possibly hinder my labours from being crowned with the wished-for success. Our habitual fondness for the one hath already brought us to the brink of ruin, and our proneness to the other hath almost discouraged all pious endeavours to promote our future happiness." In 1677 he published the first part of his England's Improvement by Sea and Land, a very remarkable book, full of sagacious insight as respected the future commercial and manufacturing greatness of England. Mr. Dove says of this book that Yarranton chalks out in the future course of England with as free a hand as if second sight had revealed to him those expansions of her industrial career which never fail to surprise us, even when we behold them realized. Besides his extensive plans for making harbours and improving internal navigation, with the object of creating new channels for domestic industry, his schemes for extending the iron and woollen trades, establishing the linen manufacture, and cultivating the home fisheries, we find him throwing out various valuable suggestions with reference to the means of facilitating commercial transactions, some of which have only been carried out in our own day. One of his grandest ideas was the establishment of a public bank, the credit of which, based on the security of freehold land, should enable its paper to go in trade equal with ready money. A bank of this sort formed one of the principal means by which the Dutch had been enabled to extend their commercial transactions, and Yarranton accordingly urged its introduction into England. Part of his scheme consisted of a voluntary register of real property, for the purpose of effecting simplicity of title and effecting relief from the excessive charges for law, as well as enabling money to be readily raised for commercial purposes on security of the land registered. He pointed out very graphically the straits to which a man is put who is possessed of real property enough, but in time of pressure is unable to turn himself round for want of ready cash. Then, says he, all his creditors crowd to him as pigs do through a hole to a bean and peas rick. Is it not a sad thing, he asks, that a goldsmith's boy in Lombard Street, who gives notes for the moneys handed him by the merchants, should take up more moneys upon his note in one day than 2 lords, 4 knights, and 8 esquires in 12 months upon all their personal securities? We are, as it were, cutting off our legs and arms to see who will feed the trunk. But we cannot expect this from any of our neighbours abroad, whose interest depends upon our loss. He therefore proposed his registry of property as a ready means of raising a credit for purposes of trade. Thus he says, "I can both in England and Wales register my wedding, my burial, and my christening, and a poor parish clerk is entrusted with the keeping of the book, and that which is registered there is held good by our law. But I cannot register my lands, to be honest, to pay every man his own, to prevent those sad things that attend families for want thereof, and to have the great benefit and advantage that would come thereby. A register will quicken trade, and the land registered will be equal as cash in a man's hands, and the credit thereof will go and do in trade what ready money now doth." His idea was to raise money, when necessary, on the land registered, by giving security thereon after a form which he suggested. He would, in fact, have made land, as gold now is, the basis of an extended currency, and he rightly held that the value of land as a security must always be unexceptionable, and superior to any metallic basis that could possibly be devised. This indefatigable man continued to urge his various designs upon the attention of the public until he was far advanced in years. He professed he was moved to do so, and we believe him, solely by an ardent love for his country, whose future flourishing, says he, is the only reward I ever hope to see of all my labours. Yarranton, however, received but little thanks for his persistence, while he encountered many rebuffs. The public, for the most part, turned a deaf ear to his entreaties, and his writings proved of comparatively small avail, at least during his own lifetime. He experienced the lot of many patriots, even the purest, the suspicion and detraction of his contemporaries. His old political enemies do not seem to have forgotten him, of which we have the evidence in certain rare broadsides still extant, twitting him upon the failure of his schemes, and even trumping up false charges of disloyalty against him. In 1681 he published the second part of England's Improvement, in which he gave a summary account of its then limited growths and manufactures, pointing out that England and Ireland were the only northern kingdoms remaining unimproved. He re-urged the benefits and necessity of a voluntary register of real property, pointed out a method of improving the Royal Navy, lessening the growing power of France and establishing home fisheries, proposed the securing and fortifying of Tangier, described a plan for preventing fires in London and reducing the charge for maintaining the trained bands, urged the formation of a harbour at Newhaven in Sussex, and finally discoursed at considerable length upon the tin, iron, linen, and woollen trades, setting forth various methods for their improvement. In this last section, after referring to the depression in the domestic tin trade, a Cornish tin selling so low as 70 shillings the hundredweight, he suggested a way of reviving it. With the Cornish tin he would combine the Roman cinders and ironstone in the Forest of Dean, which makes the best iron for most uses in the world, and works up to the best advantage, with delight and pleasure to the workman. He then described the history of his own efforts to import the manufacture of tin plates into England some 16 years before, in which he had been thwarted by Chamberlain's patent, as above described, and offered sundry queries as to the utility of patents generally, which, says he, have the tendency to drive trade out of the kingdom. Appended to the chapter on tin is an exceedingly amusing dialogue between a tin miner of Cornwall, an iron miner of Dean Forest, and a traveller himself. From this we gather that Yarranton's business continued to be that of an iron manufacturer at his works at Ashley near Bewdley. Thus the iron miner says, "About 28 years since, Mr. Yarranton found out a vast quantity of Roman cinders near the walls of the city of Worcester, from whence he and others carried away many thousand tons or loads up the river Severn unto their iron furnaces, to be melted down into iron with a mixture of the Forest of Dean ironstone, and within 100 yards of the walls of the city of Worcester there was dug up one of the hearths of the Roman footblasts, it being then firm and in order, and was 7 foot deep in the earth. And by the side of the work there was found a pot of Roman coins, to the quantity of a peck, some of which were presented to Sir William Dugdale, and part thereof is now in the King's closet." In the same year, 1681, in which the second part of England's Improvement appeared, Yarranton proceeded to Dunkirk for the purposes of making a personal survey of that port, then belonging to England, and on his return he published a map of the town, harbour, and castle on the sea, with accompanying letterpress, in which he recommended, for the safety of British trade, the demolition of the fortifications of Dunkirk before they were completed, which he held would only be for the purpose of their being garrisoned by the French king. His Full Discovery of the First Presbyterian Sham Plot was published in the same year, and from that time nothing further is known of Andrew Yarranton. His name and his writings have been alike nearly forgotten, and though Bishop Watson declared of him that he deserved to have a statue erected to his memory as a great public benefactor, we do not know that he was so much as honoured with a tombstone, for we have been unable, after careful inquiry, to discover when and where he died. Yarranton was a man whose views were far in advance of his age. the generation for whom he laboured and wrote were not ripe for their reception and realization, and his voice sounded among the people like that of one crying in the wilderness. But though his exhortations to industry and his large plans of national improvement failed to work themselves into realizations of his own time, he broke the ground, he sowed the seed, and it may be that even at this day we are in some degree reaping the results of his labours. At all events, his books still live to show how wise and sagacious Andrew Yarranton was beyond his contemporaries, and to the true methods of establishing upon solid foundations the industrial prosperity of England. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5, Part 1 of Industrial Biography, Iron Workers and Toolmakers by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Coalbrookdale Iron Works, the Darbys and Reynoldses. The triumph of the industrial arts will advance the cause of civilization more rapidly than its warmest advocates could have hoped, and contribute to the permanent prosperity and strength of the country far more than the most splendid victories of successful war. C. Babbage, The Exposition of 1851. Dud Dudley's invention of smelting iron with coke made of pit coal was, like many others, born before its time. It was neither appreciated by the ironmasters nor by the workmen. All schemes for smelting ore with any other fuel than charcoal made from wood were regarded with incredulity. As for Dudley's Metallum Martis, as it contained no specification, it revealed no secret, and when its author died, his secret, whatever it might be, died with him. Other improvements were doubtless necessary before the invention could be turned to useful account. Thus, until a more powerful blowing furnace had been contrived, the production of pit coal iron must necessarily have been limited. Dudley himself does not seem to have been able to make more on an average than 5 tons a week, and 7 tons at the outside. Nor was the iron so good as that made by charcoal, for it is admitted to have been especially liable to deterioration by the sulphurous fumes of the coal in the process of manufacture. Dr. Plot, in his History of Staffordshire, speaks of an experiment made by one Dr. Bluestone, a High German, as the last effort made in that county to smelt iron ore with pit coal. He is said to have built his furnace at Wednesbury, so ingeniously contrived that only the flame of the coal should come to the ore with several other conveniences, that many were of opinion he would succeed in it. But experience, that great baffler of speculation, showed it would not be. The sulphurous vitriolic steams that issue from the pyrites, which frequently, if not always, accompanies pit coal, ascending with the flame and poisoning the ore sufficiently to make it render much worse iron than that made with charcoal, though not perhaps so much worse as the body of the coal itself would possibly do. Dr. Plot does not give the year in which this last effort was made, but as we find that one Dr. Frederick de Blueston obtained a patent from Charles II on the 25th of October 1677 for a new and effectual way of melting down, forging, extracting and reducing of iron and all metals and minerals with pit coal and sea coal, as well and effectually as ever hath been done by charcoal, and with much less charge. And as Dr. Plot's history, in which he makes mention of the experiment and its failure, was published in 1686, it is obvious that the trial must have been made between those years. As the demand for iron steadily increased with the increasing population of the country, and as the supply of timber for smelting purposes was diminishing from year to year, England was compelled to rely more and more upon foreign countries for its supply of manufactured iron. The number of English forges rapidly dwindled, and the amount of home production became insignificant in comparison with what was imported from abroad. Yarranton, writing in 1676, speaks of The many ironworks laid down in Kent, Sussex, Surrey, and in the north of England, because the iron of Sweetland, Flanders, and Spain coming in so cheap, it cannot be made to profit here. There were many persons, indeed, who held that it was better we should be supplied with iron from Spain than make it at home, in consequence of the great waste of wood involved by the manufacture. But against this view Yarranton strongly contended, and held, what is as true now as it was then, that the manufacture of iron was the keystone of England's industrial prosperity. He also apprehended great danger to the country from want of iron in event of the contingency of a foreign war. "When the greatest part of the ironworks are asleep," said he, "if there should be occasion for great quantities of guns and bullets, and other sorts of iron commodities for a present unexpected war, and the Sound happen to be locked up, and so prevent iron coming to us, truly we should then be in a fine case." Notwithstanding these apprehended national perils arising from the want of iron, no steps seem to have been made to supply the deficiency, either by planting woods on a large scale, as recommended by Yarranton, or by other methods; and the produce of English iron continued steadily to decline. In 1720 30 there were found only 10 furnaces remaining in blast in the whole Forest of Dean, where the iron smelters were satisfied with working up merely the cinders left by the Romans. A writer of the time states that we then bought between 200,000 and 300,000 pounds worth of foreign iron yearly, and that England was the best customer in Europe for Swedish and Russian iron. By the middle of the 18th century the home manufacture had so much fallen off that the total production of Great Britain is supposed to have amounted to not more than 18,000 tons a year, 4/5 of the iron used in the country being imported from Sweden. The more that the remaining ironmasters became straitened for want of wood, the more they were compelled to resort to cinders and coke made from coal as a substitute; and it was found that under certain circumstances this fuel answered the purpose almost as well as charcoal of wood. The coke was made by burning the coal in heaps in the open air, and it was usually mixed with coal and peat in the process of smelting the ore. Coal by itself was used by the country smiths for forging whenever they could procure it for their smithy fires, and in the Midland counties they had it brought to them, sometimes from great distance, slung in bags across horses' backs, for the state of the roads was then so execrable as not to admit of its being led for any considerable distance in carts. At length we arrive at a period when coal seems to have come into general use, and when necessity led to its regular employment both in smelting the ore and in manufacturing the metal. And this brings us to the establishment of the Coalbrookdale works, where the smelting of iron by means of coke and coal was first adopted on a large scale as a regular method of manufacture. Abraham Darby, the first of a succession of iron manufacturers who bore the same name, was the son of a farmer residing in Wrensnest, near Dudley. He served an apprenticeship to a maker of malt kilns near Birmingham, after which he married and removed to Bristol in 1700, to begin business on his own account. Industry is of all politics and religions. Thus Dudley was a royalist and a churchman, Yarranton was a parliamentarian and a Presbyterian, and Abraham Darby was a Quaker. At Bristol he was joined by 3 partners of the same persuasion, who provided the necessary capital to enable him to set up works at Baptist Mills near that city, where he carried on the business of malt mill making, to which he afterwards added brass and iron founding. At that period cast iron pots were in very general use, forming the principal cooking utensils of the working class. The art of casting had, however, made such small progress in England that the pots were for the most part imported from abroad. Darby resolved, if possible, to enter upon this lucrative branch of manufacture, and he proceeded to make a number of experiments in pot making. Like others who had preceded him, he made his first moulds of clay, but they cracked and burst, and one trial failed after another. He then determined to find out the true method of manufacturing the pots, by travelling into the country from whence the best were imported, in order to master the grand secret of the trade. With this object he went over to Holland in the year of 1706, and after diligent inquiry he ascertained that the only sure method of casting Hilton ware, as such castings were then called, was in moulds of fine dry sand. This was the whole secret. Returning to Bristol, accompanied by some skilled Dutch workmen, Darby began the new manufacture, and succeeded to his satisfaction. The work was at first carried on with great secrecy, lest other makers should copy the art, and the precaution was taken of stopping the keyhole of the workshop door while the casting was in progress. To secure himself against piracy, he proceeded to take out a patent for the process in the year 1708, and it was granted for the term of 14 years. The recital of the patent is curious, as showing the backward state of English iron founding at the time. It sets forth that, whereas our trusty and well-beloved Abraham Darby of our city of Bristol, smith, hath by his petition humbly presented to us that by his study, industry, and expense, he hath found out and brought to perfection a new way of casting iron-bellied pots and other iron-bellied ware, in sand only, without loam or clay, by which such iron pots and other ware may be cast fine and with more ease and expedition, and may be afforded cheaper than they can be by the way commonly used, and in regard to their cheapness may be of great advantage to the poor of this our kingdom, who for the most part use such ware, and in all probability will prevent the merchants of England going to foreign markets for such ware, from whence great quantities are imported, and likewise may in time supply other markets with that manufacture of our dominion, etc. Grants the said Abraham Darby the full power and sole privilege to make and sell such pots and ware for and during the term of 14 years thus ensuing. Darby proceeded to make arrangements for carrying on the manufacture upon a large scale at the Baptist mills, but the other partners hesitated to embark more capital in the concern, and at length refused their concurrence. Determined not to be baulked in his enterprise, Darby abandoned the Bristol firm, and in the year 1709 he removed to Coalbrookdale in Shropshire, with the intention of prosecuting the enterprise on his own account. He took the lease of a little furnace which had existed at the place for more than a century, as the records exist of a smith or smith-house at Coalbrookdale in the time of the Tudors. The woods of oak and hazel, which at that time filled the beautiful dingles of the dale and spread in almost a continuous forest to the base of the Wrekin, furnished abundant fuel for the smithery. As the trade of the Coalbrookdale firm extended, these woods became cleared, until the same scarcity of fuel began to be experienced that had already desolated the forests of Sussex and brought the manufacture of iron in that quarter to a standstill. It appears from the blast furnace memorandum book of Abraham Darby, which we have examined, that the make of iron at the Coalbrookdale foundry in 1713 varied from 5 to 10 tons a week. The principal articles cast were pots, kettles, and other hollow ware, direct from the smelting furnace. The rest of the metal was run into pigs. In course of time we find that other castings were turned out: a few grates, smoothing irons, door frames, weights, baking plates, cart bushes, iron pestles and mortars, and occasionally a tailor's goose. The trade gradually increased until we find as many as 150 pots and kettles cast in a week. The fuel used in the furnaces appears, from the Darby memorandum book, to have been at first entirely charcoal, but the growing scarcity of wood seems to have gradually led to the use of coke, braise or small coke, and peat. An abundance of coals existed in the neighbourhood. By rejecting those of inferior quality, and coking the others with great care, a combustible was obtained better fitted even than charcoal itself for the fusion of that particular kind of ore which is found in the coal measures. Thus we find Darby's most favourite charge for his furnaces to have been 5 baskets of coke, 2 of braise, and 1 of peat. Next followed the ore, and then the limestone. The use of charcoal was gradually given up as the art of smelting with coke and braise improved, most probably aided by the increased power of the furnace blast, until at length we find it entirely discontinued. The castings of Coalbrookdale gradually acquired a reputation, and the trade of Abraham Darby continued to increase until the date of his death, which occurred at Madeley Court in 1717. His sons were too young at the time to carry on the business which he had so successfully started, and several portions of the works were sold at a serious sacrifice. But when the sons had grown up to manhood, they too entered upon the business of iron founding, and Abraham Darby's son and grandson, both of the same name, largely extended the operations of the firm until Coalbrookdale, or, as it was popularly called, Bedlam, became the principal seat of one of the most important branches of the iron trade. There seems to be some doubt as to the precise time when pit coal was first regularly employed at Coalbrookdale in smelting the ore. Mr. Scrivener says, "Pit coal was first used by Mr. Abraham Darby in his furnace at Coalbrookdale in 1713," but we can find no confirmation of this statement in the records of the company. It is probable that Mr. Darby used raw coal, as was done in the Forest of Dean at the same time, in the process of calcinating the ore, but it would appear from his own memoranda that coke only was used in the process of smelting. We infer from other circumstances that pit coal was not employed for the latter purpose until a considerably later period. The merit of its introduction and its successful use in iron smelting is due to Mr. Richard Ford, who had married a daughter of Abraham Darby and managed the Coalbrookdale works in 1747. In a paper by the Reverend Mr. Mason, Woodwardian Professor at Cambridge, given in the Philosophical Transactions for that year, the first account of its successful employment is stated as follows: "Several attempts have been made to run iron ore with pit coal, and he (Mr. Mason) thinks it has not been succeeded anywhere, as we have had no account of it being practised. But Mr. Ford of Coalbrookdale in Shropshire, from iron ore and coal both got in the same dale, makes iron brittle or tough as he pleases, there being cannon thus cast so soft as to bear turning like wrought iron." Most probably, however, it was not until the time of Richard Reynolds, who succeeded Abraham Darby II in the management of the works in 1757, that pit coal came into large and regular use in the blasting furnaces as well as the fineries of Coalbrookdale. Richard Reynolds was born at Bristol in 1735. His parents, like the Darbys, belonged to the Society of Friends, and he was educated in that persuasion. Being a spirited, lively youth, the old Adam occasionally cropped out in him, and he is even said, when a young man, to have been so much fired by the heroism of the soldier's character that he felt a strong desire to embrace a military career. But this feeling soon died out, and he dropped into the sober and steady rut of the Society. After serving an apprenticeship in his native town, he was sent to Coalbrookdale on a mission of business, where he became acquainted with the Darby family, and shortly after married Hannah, the daughter of Abraham II. He then entered upon the conduct of the iron and coal works at Ketley and Horsehay, where he resided for 6 years, removing to Coalbrookdale in 1763 to take charge of the works there on the death of his father-in-law. By the exertions and enterprise of the Darbys, the Coalbrookdale works had become greatly enlarged, giving remunerative employment to a large and increasing population. The firm had extended their operation far beyond the boundaries of the Dale. They had established foundries at London, Bristol, and Liverpool, and agencies at Newcastle and Truro, for the disposal of steam engines and other iron machinery used in the deep mines of those districts. Watt had not yet perfected his steam engine, but there was a considerable demand for pumping engines of Newcomen's construction, many of which were made at the Coalbrookdale works. The increasing demand for iron gave an impetus to coal mining, which in its turn stimulated inventors in their improvement of the power of the steam engine, for the coal could not be worked quickly and advantageously unless the pits could be kept clear of water. Thus one invention stimulates another, and when the steam engine had been perfected by Watt, and enabled powerful blowing apparatus to be worked by its agency, we find that the production of iron, by means of pit coal being rendered cheap and expeditious, soon became enormously increased. We are informed that it was while Richard Reynolds had charge of the Coalbrookdale works that a further important improvement was effected in the manufacture of iron by pit coal. Up to this time, the conversion of crude or cast iron into malleable iron bar had been effected entirely by means of charcoal. The process was carried on in a fire called a finery, somewhat like that of a smith's forge, the iron being exposed to the blast of a powerful bellows and in constant contact with the fuel. In the first process of fusing the ironstone, coal had been used for some time with increasing success. But the question arose whether coal might not be used with effect in the second or refining stage. Two of the foremen, named Cranage, suggested to Mr. Reynolds that this might be performed in what is called a reverberatory furnace, in which the iron should not mix with the coal, but be heated solely by the flame. Mr. Reynolds greatly doubted the feasibility of the operation, but he authorized the Cranage to make an experiment of their process, the result of which will be found described in the following extract of a letter from Mr. Reynolds to Mr. Thomas Goldney of Bristol, dated Coalbrookdale, 25th of April, 1766. I come now to what I think a matter of very great consequence. It is some time since Thomas Cranage, who works at Bridgnorth Forge, and his brother George of the Dale, spoke to me about a notion they had conceived of making bar iron without wood charcoal. I told them, consistent with the notion I had adopted, in common with all others I had conversed with, that I thought it impossible, because the vegetable salts in the charcoal, being an alkali, acted as an absorbent to the sulphur of the iron, which occasions the red short quality of the iron, and pit coal abounding with sulphur would increase it. This specious answer, which would probably have appeared conclusive to most, and which indeed was what I really thought, was not so to them. They replied that from the observations they had made, and repeated conversations together, they were both firmly of opinion that the alteration from the quality of pig iron into that of bar iron was effected merely by heat, and if I would give them leave they would make a trial some day. I consented, but I confess without any great expectation of their success, and so the matter rested some weeks, when, it happening that some repairs had to be done at Bridgnorth, Thomas came up to the Dale, and with his brother made a trial in Thomas Tilley's air furnace, with such success as I thought would justify the erection of a small air furnace at the forge, for the more perfectly ascertaining the merit of the invention. This was accordingly done, and a trial of it has been made this week, and the success has surpassed the most sanguine expectations. The iron put into the furnace was of old bushes, which thou knowest are always made of hard iron, and the iron drawn out is the toughest I ever saw. A bar of 1 1/4 inch square, when broke, appears to have very little cold short in it. I look upon it as one of the most important discoveries ever made, and take the liberty of recommending thee and earnestly requesting thou wouldst take out a patent for it immediately. The specification of the invention will be comprised in a few words, as it will only set forth that, a reverberatory furnace being built of a proper construction, the pig or cast iron is put into it, and without the addition of anything else than common raw pit coal, is converted into good malleable iron, and being taken red hot from the reverberatory furnace to the forge hammer, is drawn out into bars of various shapes and sizes, according to the will of the workman. Mr. Reynolds's advice was implicitly followed. A patent was secured in the name of the brothers Cranage, dated 17th of June 1766, and the identical words in the above letter were adopted in the specification as descriptive of the process. By this method of puddling, as it is termed, the manufacturer was thenceforth enabled to produce iron in increased quantity and at a large reduction in price. And though the invention of the Cranages was greatly improved upon by Onions and subsequently by Cort, there can be no doubt as to the originality and the importance of their invention. Mr. Tyler states that he was informed by the son of Richard Reynolds that the wrought iron made at Coalbrookdale by the Cranage process was very good, quite tough, and broke with a long, bright, fibrous fracture. That made by Cort afterwards was quite different. Though Mr. Reynolds's generosity to the Cranages is apparent in the course which he adopted in the securing for them a patent for the invention in their own names, it does not appear to have proved much advantage to them, and they failed to rise above the rank which they occupied when their valuable discovery was patented. This, however, was no fault of Richard Reynolds, but was mainly attributable to the circumstance of other inventions in a great measure superseding their process, and depriving them of the benefits of their ingenuity. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. Chapter 5, Part 2 of Industrial Biography, Ironworkers and Toolmakers, by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Coalbrookdale Ironworks, the Darbys and Reynoldses. Among the important improvements introduced by Mr. Reynolds while managing the Coalbrookdale works was the adoption by him for the first time of iron instead of wooden rails in the tramroads, along which coal and iron were conveyed from one part of the works to another, as well as to the loading places along the River Severn. He observed that the wooden rails soon became decayed, besides being liable to be broken by the heavy loads passing over them, occasioning much loss of time, interruption to business, and heavy expense in repairs. It occurred to him that these inconveniences would be obviated by the use of rails of cast iron, and having tried an experiment with them, it answered so well that in 1767 the whole of the wooden rails were taken up and replaced by rails of iron. Thus was the era of iron railroads fairly initiated at Coalbrookdale, and the example of Mr. Reynolds was shortly after followed on all the tramroads throughout the country. It is also worthy of note that the first iron bridge ever erected was cast and made at the Coalbrookdale works. Its projection as well as its erection was mainly due to the skill and enterprise of Abraham Darby III. When but a young man, he showed indications of that sagacity and energy in business which seemed to be hereditary in his family. One of the first things he did on arriving at man's estate was to set on foot a scheme for throwing a bridge across the Severn at Coalbrookdale, at a point where the banks were steep and slippery, to accommodate the large population which had sprung up along both banks of the river. There were now thriving iron, brick, and pottery works established in the parishes of Madeley and Broseley, and the old ferry on the Severn was found altogether inadequate for ready communications between one bank and the other. The want of a bridge had long been felt, and a plan of one had been prepared during the life of Abraham Darby II, but the project was suspended at his death. When his son came of age, he resolved to take up his father's dropped scheme and prosecute it to completion, which he did. Young Mr. Darby became Lord of the Manor of Madeley in 1776, and was the owner of one half of the ferry in right of his lordship. He was so fortunate as to find the owner of the other, or Broseley half, of the ferry equally anxious with himself to connect the two banks of the river by means of a bridge. The necessary powers were accordingly obtained from Parliament, and a bridge was authorized to be built of cast iron, stone, brick, or timber. A company was formed for the purpose of carrying out the project, and the shares were taken by the adjoining owners, Abraham Darby being the principal subscriber. The construction of a bridge of iron was an entirely new idea. An attempt had indeed been made at Lyons, in France, to construct such a bridge more than 20 years before, but it had entirely failed, and a bridge of timber was erected instead. It is not known whether the Coalbrookdale masters had heard of the attempt, but even if they had, it could have been of no practical use to them. Mr. Pritchard, an architect of Shrewsbury, was first employed to prepare a design of the intended structure, which is still preserved. Although Mr. Pritchard proposed to introduce cast iron in the arch of the bridge, which was to be of 120 feet span, it was only as a sort of key, occupying but a few feet at the crown of the arch. This sparing use of cast iron indicates the timidity of the architect in dealing with the new material, his plan exhibiting a desire to effect a compromise between the tried and the untried in bridge construction. But the use of iron to so limited an extent, and in such a part of the structure, was of more than questionable utility. and if Mr. Pritchard's plan had been adopted, the problem of the iron bridge would still have remained unsolved. The plan, however, after having been duly considered, was eventually set aside, and another, with the entire arch of cast iron, was prepared, under the superintendence of Abraham Darby, by Mr. Thomas Gregory, his foreman of pattern makers. This plan was adopted, and arrangements were forthwith made for carrying it into effect. The abutments of the bridge were built in 1777-8, during which the castings were made at the foundry, and the ironwork was successfully erected in the course of 3 months. The bridge was opened for traffic in 1779, and proved a most serviceable structure. In 1788, the Society of Arts recognised Mr. Darby's merit as its designer and erector by presenting him with their gold medal, and the model of the bridge is still to be seen in the collection of the Society. Mr. Robert Stevenson has said of the structure, "If we consider that the manipulation of cast iron was then completely in its infancy, a bridge of such dimensions was doubtless a bold as well as an original undertaking, and the efficiency of the details is worthy of the boldness of the conception." Mr. Stevenson adds that from a defect in the construction the abutments were thrust inwards at the approaches, and the ribs partially fractured. We are, however, informed that this is a mistake, though it does appear that the apprehension at one time existed that such an accident might possibly occur. To remedy the supposed defect, 2 small land arches were in the year 1800 substituted for the stone approach of the Broseley side of the bridge. While the work was in progress, Mr. Telford, the well-known engineer, carefully examined the bridge, and thus spoke of its condition at the time: "The great improvement of erecting upon a navigable river a bridge of cast iron with 1 arch only was first put in practice near Coalbrookdale. The bridge was executed in 1777 by Mr. Abraham Darby, and the ironwork is now quite as perfect as when it was first put up. Drawings of this bridge have long been before the public, and have been much and justly admired." A Coalbrookdale correspondent, writing in May 1862, informs us that at the present time the bridge is undergoing repair, and special examination having been made, there is no appearance either that the abutments have moved, or that the ribs have been broken in the centre, or are out of their proper right line. There has, it is true, been a strain on the land arches and on the roadway plates, which, however, the main arch has been able effectually to resist. The bridge has now been in profitable daily use for upwards of 80 years, and has during that time proved of the greatest convenience to the population of the district. So judicious was the selection of its site, and so great its utility, that a thriving town of the name of Ironbridge has grown up around it, upon what, at the time of its erection, was a nameless part of the waste of the manor of Madeley. And it is probable that the bridge will last for centuries to come. Thus also was the use of iron as an important material in bridge construction fairly initiated at Coalbrookdale by Abraham Darby, as the use of iron rails was by Richard Reynolds. We need scarcely add that since the invention and extensive adoption of railway locomotion, the employment of iron in various forms in railway and bridge structures has rapidly increased, until iron has come to be regarded as the very sheet anchor of the railway engineer. In the meantime, the works at Coalbrookdale had become largely extended. In 1784, when the government of the day proposed to levy a tax on pit coal, Richard Reynolds strongly urged upon Mr. Pitt, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, as well as on Lord Gower, afterwards Marquis of Stafford, the impolicy of such a tax. To the latter he represented that large capitals had been invested in the iron trade, which was with difficulty carried on in the face of the competition with Swedish and Russian iron. At Coalbrookdale, 16 fire engines, as steam engines were first called, were then at work, 8 blast furnaces and 9 forges, besides the air furnaces and mills at the foundry, which, with the levels, roads, and more than 20 miles of iron railways, gave employment to a very large number of people. "The advancement of the iron trade within these few years," said he, "has been prodigious. It was thought, and justly, that the making of pig iron with pit coal was a great acquisition to the country, by saving the wood and supplying a material to the manufactures, the production of which, by the consumption of all the wood the country produced, was formerly unequal to the demand; and the nail trade, perhaps the most considerable of any one article of manufactured iron, would have been lost to this country had it not been found practicable to make nails of iron made with pit coal. We have now another process to attempt, and that is to make bar iron with pit coal; and it is for that purpose we have made, or rather are making, alterations at Donnington Wood, Ketley, and elsewhere, which we expect to complete in the present year, but not at a less expense than £20,000, which will be lost to us and gained by nobody if this tax is laid upon our coals." He would not, however, have it understood that he sought for any protection for the home-made iron, notwithstanding the lower prices of the foreign article. "From its most imperfect state as pig iron," he observed to Lord Sheffield, "to its highest finish in the regulating springs of a watch, we have nothing to fear if the importation into each country should be permitted without duty." We need scarcely add that the subsequent history of the iron trade abundantly justified these sagacious anticipations of Richard Reynolds. He was now far advanced in years. His business had prospered, his means were ample, and he sought retirement. He did not desire to possess great wealth, which in his opinion entailed such serious responsibilities upon its possessor, and he held that the accumulation of large property was more to be depreciated than desired. He therefore determined to give up his shares in the ironworks at Ketley to his sons William and Joseph, who continued to carry them on. William was a man of eminent ability, well versed in science, and an excellent mechanic. He introduced great improvements in the working of the coal and iron mines, employing new machinery for their purpose, and availing himself with much ingenuity of the discoveries then being made in the science of chemistry. He was also an inventor, having been first to employ, in 1788, inclined planes, consisting of parallel railways to connect and work canals of different levels, an invention erroneously attributed to Fulton, but which the latter himself acknowledged to belong to William Reynolds. In the first chapter of his Treatise on Canal Navigation, published in 1796, Fulton says, "As local prejudices opposed the Duke of Bridgewater's canal in the first instance, prejudices equally strong as firmly adhered to the principle on which it was constructed, and it was thought impossible to lead one through a country, or to work it to any advantage, unless by locks and boats of at least 25 tons, till the genius of Mr. William Reynolds of Ketley, in Shropshire, stepped from the accustomed path, constructed the first inclined plane, and introduced boats of 5 tons. This, like the Duke's Canal, was deemed a visionary project, and particularly by his Grace, who was partial to locks. Yet this is also introduced into practice, and will in many instances supersede lock canals." Telford, the engineer, also gracefully acknowledged the valuable assistance he received from William Reynolds in planning the iron aqueduct, by means of which the Ellesmere Canal was carried over the Pont Casilta, and in executing the necessary castings for the purpose at the Ketley foundry. The future management of his extensive ironworks being thus placed in able hands, Richard Reynolds finally left Coalbrookdale in 1804 for Bristol, his native town, where he spent the remainder of his life in works of charity and mercy. Here we might leave the subject, but cannot refrain from adding a few concluding words as to the moral characteristics of this truly good man. Though habitually religious, he was neither demure nor morose, but cheerful, gay, and humorous. He took great interest in the pleasures of the young people about him, and exerted himself in all ways to promote their happiness. He was fond of books, pictures, poetry, and music, though the indulgence of artistic tastes is not thought becoming in the society to which he belonged. His love for the beauties of nature amounted almost to a passion, and when living at the Bank near Ketley, it was his great delight in the summer evenings to retire with his pipe to a rural seat commanding a full view of the Wrekin, the Urquhart woods, with Cadair Idris and the Montgomeryshire hills in the distance, and watch the sun go down in the west in his glory. Once in every year he assembled a large party to spend a day with him on the Wrekin, and amongst those invited were the principal clerks in the company's employment, together with their families. At Madeley, near Coalbrookdale, where he bought a property, he laid out for the express use of the workmen extensive walks through the woods on Lincoln Hill, commanding beautiful views. They were called the Workmen's Walks, and were a source of great enjoyment to them and their families, especially on Sunday afternoons. When Mr. Reynolds went to London on business, he was accustomed to make a round of visits on his way home to places remarkable for their picturesque beauty, such as Stowe, Hagley Park, and the Leasows. After a visit to the latter place in 1767, he thus, in a letter to his friend John Macapin, vindicated his love for the beautiful in nature: "I think it is not only lawful but expedient to cultivate a disposition to be pleased with the beauties of nature by frequent indulgence for that purpose. The mind, by being continually applied to the consideration of ways and means to gain money, contracts an indifferency, if not an insensibility, to the profusion of beauties which the benevolent Creator has impressed upon every part of the material creation. A sordid love of gold, the possession of what gold can purchase, and the reputation of being rich, have so depraved the finer feelings of some men that they pass through the most delightful grove, filled with the melody of nature, or listen to the murmurings of the brook in a valley, with as little pleasure, and with no more of the vernal delight which Milton describes, than they feel in passing through some obscure alley in a town." When in the prime of life, Mr. Reynolds was an excellent rider, performing all his journeys on horseback. He used to give a ludicrous account of a race he once ran with another youth, each having a lady seated on a pillion behind him. Mr. Reynolds reached the goal first, but when he looked round, he found that he had lost his fair companion, who had fallen off in the race. On another occasion he had a hard run with Lord Thurlow during a visit paid by the latter to the Ketley ironworks. Lord Thurlow pulled up his horse first, and observed, laughing, "I think, Mr. Reynolds, this is probably the first time that ever a Lord Chancellor rode a race with a Quaker." But a stranger rencontre was one which befell Mr. Reynolds on Blackheath. Though he declined government orders for cannon, he seems to have a secret hankering after the pomp and circumstance of military life. At all events, he was present on Blackheath one day when George III. Was reviewing some troops. Mr. Reynolds' horse, an old trooper, no sooner heard the sound of the trumpet than he started off at full speed, and made directly for the group of officers before whom the troops were defiling. Great was the surprise of the king when he saw the Quaker draw up alongside of him, but still greater perhaps was the confusion of the Quaker at finding himself in such company. During the later years of his life, while living at Bristol, his hand was in every good work, and it was often felt where it was not seen, for he carefully avoided ostentation, and preferred doing his good in secret. He strongly disapproved of making charitable bequests by will, which he observed in many cases to have been the foundations of enormous abuses, but held it to be the duty of each man to do all the possible good he could during his lifetime. Many were the instances of his princely, though at the time unknown, munificence. Unwilling to be recognised as the giver of large sums, he employed agents to dispense his anonymous benefactions. He thus sent £20,000 to London to be distributed during the distress of 1795. He had 4 almoners constantly employed in Bristol, finding out cases of distress, relieving them, and presenting their accounts to him weekly, with details of the cases relieved. He searched the debtors' prisons, and where, as often happened, deserving but unfortunate men were found confined for debt, he paid the claims against them and procured their release. Such a man could not fail to be followed with blessings and gratitude, but these he sought to direct to the Giver of all good. "My talent," said he to a friend, "is the meanest of all talents, a little sordid dust. But as the man in the parable who had but one talent was held accountable, I also am accountable for the talent that I possess, humble as it is, to the great Lord of all." On one occasion the case of a poor orphan boy was submitted to him, whose parents, both dying young, had left him destitute, on which Mr. Reynolds generously offered to place a sum in the name of trustees for his education and maintenance, until he could be apprenticed to a business. The lady who represented the case was so overpowered by the munificence of the act that she burst into tears, and, struggling to express her gratitude, concluded with, "And when the dear child is old enough, I will teach him to thank his benefactor." "Thou must teach him to look higher," interrupted Reynolds. "Do we thank the clouds for rain? When the child grows up, teach him to thank him who sendeth both the clouds and the rain." Reynolds himself deplored his infirmity of temper, which was by nature hasty; and as his benevolence was known, and appeals were made to him at all times, seasonable and unseasonable, he sometimes met them with a sharp word, which, however, he had scarcely uttered before he repented of it; and he is known to have followed a poor woman to her home and asked forgiveness for having spoken hastily in answer to her application for help. This great good man died on the 10th of September 1816, in the 81st year of his age. At his funeral the poor of Bristol were the chief mourners. The children of the benevolent societies which he had munificently supported during his lifetime, and some of which he had founded, followed his body to the grave. The procession was joined by the clergy and ministers of all denominations, and by men of all classes and persuasions. And thus was Richard Reynolds laid to his rest, leaving behind him a name full of good odour, which will long be held in grateful remembrance by the inhabitants of Bristol. End of chapter 5.